So we all know what the president probably will say, but what should he say? That's a different matter. And for that, we have to bring in tonight's party panel. We've got Real Clear Politics co-founder and executive editor as well. Tom Bevan is back, along with Democrat strategist, radio host, and Fox News contributor Leslie Marshall. What? And 2020 Libertarian Party vice presidential candidate Spike Cohen. He's going to break everything down, and I'm very much looking forward to all of this. Welcome, one and all. So, Tom Bevan, it's a little too early for him to take a total victory lap, but he will tout some of his successes. But what would you like to hear from the president?
Well, I mean, he is proposing something on the order of $4 trillion tonight. He's going to talk, as you mentioned, as Blake just mentioned, right? He's going to push the American Jobs Plan. Now he's introducing a new plan that's $2 trillion. So, it would be nice to know how he is going to pay for that. And we know some of the details of that. I'm not sure how much he's going to expose in terms of the taxes that he wants to raise and how far down the ladder that's going to go in terms of hitting it into the middle class. But look, he's going to take a victory lap. There's no question about that. I expect him also to touch on criminal justice reform. That's something that is a hot topic right now. The House has put a couple of bills out there. There's talk of work with Tim Scott in the Senate. And so I expect that'll be another subject that he touches on tonight.
And Leslie, he's also going to touch on immigration. He has to, because that is a crisis that is growing by the day. More and more people coming over the border. We're going to hear about April numbers next week, obviously. And this has been a sore point for this president. And this is one of the few areas where, according to approval polls, the Fox News latest poll, he's underwater on border security and immigration. Can he say anything tonight to sort of ease the pressure from Republicans?
Absolutely, because one of the things, and it's funny you read my mind, Kennedy, because that's exactly, if you said, what do you want to hear from the president tonight? I want him as a Democrat to take a victory lap. By the way, every president does every time they address Congress and the nation. And we know everything that he's going to talk about, which the majority of Americans support when you're looking at universal pre-K, when you're looking at child care, when you're looking at paid family leave. But to immigration, that's something I do want to hear about, because, immigration isn't a Democrat problem, a Joe Biden problem. Immigration's been a problem largely for 17 years through various administrations in this country. So I would like to hear some specifics. I think we're going to talk a little bit more specific in this program later on that and hear him break it down, because that's exactly what the president's kind of signaling, is breaking down a much needed comprehensive piece of legislation into more than one part.
Yes, and we will get into that, because that should be a bigger piece of this. But Spike, I think what the president is trying to do here, because if you notice all of these new massive spending packages, they all have the same price tag. They're all around $1.8 trillion, which sounds like a lot of money unless you confuse the American public. And if people think there's only one spending package, they're almost fine with it. What they don't realize is we're essentially on our fourth one.
Well, and also when you look at the fact that the American people only get about 10 to 20 cents on the dollar of what's being spent, the rest of it go to the crony corporations that put all these politicians in office and big government programs. And I think if people knew that, and if they also realized the fact that all taxation is ultimately paid for by the end user, which means they're the ones paying for it, and that they're also the ones paying for it with the fact that the Federal Reserve is having to print out these endless trillions of notes that they then lend to the federal government, which reduces the value of your currency, makes the cost of living go up, and then you get stuck with the bill with interest for the next 40 years for that. I think all of a sudden that becomes a lot less attractive. I think if I were Joe Biden's on his staff, I would hope that he would stick to the script, not stare off into the lights too much, and just finish it off and go home. I think instead we're going to see what we typically see from Joe Biden, which is a lot of stammering and a lot of forgetting where he is in place, and hopefully some entertainment. But I don't think we're going to get a lot of real answers.
No, people are talking about taking the over-under for the hour mark. I'm going to take the under, because I don't think that he has the stamina, and I don't think his minders will let him go past 60 minutes. We will find out. It's all coming up in less than an hour, and the panel's going to stick around because we have much more with them. Oh, superstar podcaster Joe Rogan taking heat from the Fauci flock after suggesting that young people, they don't need to take the COVID-19 vaccine. Why? Joe went on to explain that his young daughters had COVID, and while it affects everyone differently, For them, it was nothing but a small cold. Today, Dr. Fauci pushed back, calling Rogan's comments incorrect, though he didn't quite explain how. So a year into this pandemic, who should we listen to? The party panel is back. Tom Bevan, Leslie Marshall, and Spike Cohen. So, Tom, I will start with you. Is Joe Rogan wrong here?
Well, I mean, that depends on your perspective. I mean, he's certainly entitled to his opinion. And for all the people out there who said he has to lose his job because he said this, that's ridiculous, right? And I also don't subscribe to the idea that everyone is sitting around saying, like, taking their medical advice from Joe Rogan, right? And they're, oh, he said I shouldn't take the vaccine, so therefore I'm not going to take it. I think people are going to make their own informed decisions. And look, Fauci's position, his pushback was, look, you need to be vaccinated, even if you're young, because you don't want to, get COVID and be, unwittingly pass it along asymptomatically to other people, right? So you're doing it for the greater good, for the common good. And there's merit to that. So look, I think people have to make their own decision, but Joe Rogan is certainly entitled to his opinion, and the idea that he somehow should be censored or canceled for that is just ridiculous.
Well, he does get paid a lot of money to spout his opinions. Leslie, you have the same job. You're a talk radio host. You know that your job is to come up with big opinions, and people have a lot of them about COVID. So we've talked a lot.
Yeah,
and
but
people had a lot to say about who should get the vaccine first. Okay, hold on, Leslie. I'm not done asking the question. Hang on. So we've talked. It's okay. We've talked a lot about who should get the vaccine first. People had huge opinions about that, and I shared them. People in vulnerable communities, people in nursing homes, particularly people of color in nursing homes, they should get the vaccine first. But we didn't really talk about who should get it last, and I think that's a fair discussion. Go ahead.
Well, he wasn't saying who can get it last. He was saying if you're 21 and healthy, you shouldn't get it. And here's the problem. If you look at some states, Michigan is a very good example of this right now. In the state of Michigan, they're not only having spikes, they're seeing unusually high numbers of young people in the hospital wards right now. And this is not just due to COVID-19 1, but one of the many now 5 mutations, variants of this virus. Look, I'm a talk show host, Kennedy. If you have a heart attack, if you get cancer or break a leg, do not come to me because I am not a doctor. And Joe Rogan's not a doctor. And he can say, in my opinion, if you're 21, blah, 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 blah. Those 3 words are very powerful, and as a matter of fact, they save some people lawsuits.
If you're asking
that is what he was saying.
Yeah, Spike, go ahead. But he was saying, like, if you're young and healthy,
if
you're
asking me, he said.
Yes, that's the same thing.
Joe Rogan has never claimed to be a doctor.
I don't like
and
it.
in fact, on his show, he talks a lot about the fact that he's a comedian. What he was saying is that, in his opinion, people under the age of 21 probably don't need to take it, especially if they're healthy. He also said, don't do anything stupid. Kennedy, we know the numbers. If you're under the age of 21, the odds of dying or having serious complications from COVID are actually lower than they are from the common flu for that age group. Given that, I think that you can decide whether or not you agree with Joe Rogan. But it's interesting that the government, who didn't allow doctors and medical professionals to test COVID patients for the first several weeks that the virus was here, and then started shoving COVID patients into nursing homes and mental health facilities where the people who were the most likely to die from it would get more easily infected, and then turned around and used that crisis to push for long-term lockdowns, which have been demonstrated not to work to do anything other than to cause massive human suffering and economic devastation, is very troubled about the fact that a podcaster gave his opinion about vaccines.
Yes, and many non-medical people have weighed in, to your point, Spike, who actually have a lot greater jurisdiction over some of those choices. And many of their choices were not informed by science, as they have promised. So, Leslie, I know your husband's a doctor, and I'm a doctor to a lot of people.
I didn't mention it, you did.
What's that? Oh, yeah, I did mention it because...
I didn't mention it, you did.
No, a lot of people consider me to be a medical professional, so I do offer advice, especially when it's unsolicited. Party panel returning later on in the show. We got breaking news tonight. Here's a look live inside on Capitol Hill, where President Biden expected to speak in about 10 to 15 minutes. Big topic tonight will likely be immigration. The crisis on our southern border has been one of the biggest challenges of President Biden's first 100 days. And it's getting worse, and it has been completely overwhelming for this administration. While tonight the president may tout his so-called accomplishments and skirt all responsibility for the actions that have left thousands of migrant children abandoned at the border, with hundreds of thousands more expected over the course of the rest of this year, the president and Congress need to get their acts together and pass some sort of immigration reform to help these desperate kids. So what could President Biden say tonight to make a difference on immigration. Let's get back into it with the party panel. Tom Bevan, Leslie Marshall, and Spike Cohen. Tom, he can't keep selling this line that there is no crisis at the border. That's a cruel and inhumane thing to say to kids who have been caught in the middle. So he's got to say something different.
Yeah, look, if I were advising him, I'd tell him not to mention it and just skip over it. I mean, it's the worst issue that, out of all the issues in terms of his handling of it by far, and particularly not just among Republicans, but among independents. And every time he opens his mouth on the issue, he makes it worse because he can't talk about border security or the left wing of his party goes crazy. And if he tries to say, the line that they've been using is, well, Trump left us a mess and we're trying to rebuild the system. And everybody knows his policy is a mess. And, including Democrats. And so I think it's just a losing issue for him. And so I don't think he's going to spend much time on it. He may say, listen, tell Congress, urge them to get some comprehensive immigration reform passed. But he's certainly not going to dwell on the details of what's going on down there now because it's a disaster.
And Leslie, he could talk about increasing the number of refugees and asylees. But the problem isn't that arbitrary number. The problem is there's a multi-year backlog to see a judge. So, instead of talking about great feelings, why doesn't he appoint more judges to the border, to these courts, so they can at least help people get through?
Well, actually, that's something Democrats have been asking presidents, whether it's Barack Obama or Donald Trump, to do for years. And hopefully Joe Biden will, not in the first 100 days, but he does have 4 years at least, if not 8, to get that done. What he can do with regard to immigration, and what he can speak about is something that he actually foreshadowed earlier, which was breaking this down. There is bipartisan support among Democrat and Republicans, not just voters, but politicians in Washington, as to the DACA recipients. That's one area that can be discussed. There is also bipartisan agreement that, we can perhaps do something to slow down or stop the flow from these countries. That's something that Vice President Kamala Harris is working on.
I'm going to let you in on...
These things come into pieces.
I understand. I'm going to let you in on a little secret. If you tackle DACA first and you telegraph that young people will be citizens, guess what's going to happen? More people are going to send their kids alone on that horrific journey. That's not what you should do first. What you should do first...
I didn't say it was first. I was giving that as one example of where they could have legislation
we have limited time,
solely could have bipartisan support and passage.
I'm going to move on to Spike because he's down there. Spike, the vice president says that she's only tackling the root causes. What is the root cause of our immigration crisis, Spike Cohen?
The root cause is all the policies that Joe Biden was pushing for in the Senate for the multiple decades that he was in there. If you look at the war on drugs, which led to narco-terrorists taking over entire countries and using political violence against anyone who didn't support them, that's been the single biggest contributor to this massive surge of migrants coming from Central America. And Joe Biden is one of the architects of those policies. And we know now that, for all of his talk about, scaling back on the war on drugs, he's expanding it now to the war on menthols and Newport. So it doesn't look like that's going to be ending anytime soon, punishing communities of color for using drugs and then putting them in jail for it and causing violence in Central America. The reality is, so long as we continue to have a war on drugs that destabilizes Central America and a war on migration that gives rise to smuggling cartels and is creating this crisis, it's only going to get worse and worse and worse. And he can keep building cages and putting families and children in it. He can keep, talking about dignity and justice while expanding upon the war on migration, but none of that is going to fix it. You only fix it by addressing the actual cause.
And the drug war, legalize drugs. That's how you tackle the root causes. Tom, Leslie, and Spike, thank you all so much.